Sonic, the heart of your system.
ASRock are back at it with yet another interesting motherboard, and this time with the X570 Phantom Gaming ITX-TB3. Note the TB3 at the end, as I believe this is the only mini ITX X570 board to offer Thunderbolt 3. Board aesthetics aren't bad, and we see a mostly black and silver theme with a splash of red. I actually don't mind the red on this ITX board, as RGB is very limited. Speaking of RGB, you'll find a slight glow coming from the very bottom of the board. Also a 5 and 12 volt RGB header are located at the top right. This can all be controlled from either the BIOS or via the Polychrome RGB software for hardware syncing. When it comes to ITX, ASRock are used to having a few tricks up their sleeves, and this board is no exception. In case you haven't noticed it yet, this AMD X570 board actually offers Intel 1150X cooler mounting. This is definitely a first from what I've seen, as this motherboard is just so heavily congested, there was no way AM4 mounting was going to work. And as Intel mounting is square, we now have 4 ways for mounting your CPU cooler instead of 2. The only downside I see to this is most AMD CPUs come boxed with pretty decent CPU coolers. These are of course based on AM4 mounts, so they won't work on this board. I also recommend heading to ASRock's CPU cooler compatibility link on the product page for this board. Hopefully these are updated regularly, as even with Intel mounting, CPU cooler support is still very slim. So slim that even some all-in-one coolers won't fit. Power delivery is handled by an 8+2 Dr. Moss digital VRM and can be found delivering 60 amps per phase. As I only have a 3600 CPU, I can't really push this board to its limits. But running AIDA64 CPU tests for about 10 minutes saw the VRM reach around 50 degrees, while the CPU reached 81 degrees with the Thermaltake engine CPU cooler. ASRock have approached the VRM layout slightly different from the other brands out there. Instead of one long run of VRMs, on this board we see they are split. A top section cooled via a large beefy heatsink, which would most likely be actively cooled by your case's cooling, and then a second group of VRMs which are cooled via a large solid block of aluminum which makes up the rear I/O cover. It's definitely doing its job, as sometimes it was reaching 46 degrees. A single 8-pin EPS is found on the board, which seems to be the standard for high-end ITX now. Chipset cooling is also interesting with this upright angular heatsink which has a fan embedded in it. This really brings back those Nvidia N4 780i days with that heatsink style. Once the board is in a case, the chipset fan is basically inaudible, but ASRock do offer a few predefined fan modes within the BIOS. Memory support is up to DDR4 4533 plus OC, and I had no issues here running the new G.SKill Tident Z Neo at 3600 CL16. I was also able to push this kit up to 4200 MHz. M.2 options on the ITX-TB3 are lacking, with only one on the rear of the board. After a little bit of web browsing on this board, it seems this is the main setback people are talking about. Just to note that there is no M.2 cooling, so make sure if you're running a PCIe Gen 4 SSD that it comes with its own cooling. And being at the back of the board, you're also limited by the M.2 heatsink height. Our Sabrent Rocket PCIe Gen 4 M.2 had to ditch its massive heatsink for a more streamlined third-party option. NVMe performance was roughly the same as the previous board I tested, and my Sabrent Rocket Gen 4 drive performed extremely well. You'll also find 4 right-angled SATA ports at the bottom right of the board. For network connectivity, you'll find a single Intel i211AT adapter and an 802.11ax module. Still, I would love to see an ITX board with 2.5 gigabit or even 10 gigabit Ethernet one day. Wi-Fi 6 performance was in line to what I previously tested. With our TP-Link AX6000 router, I saw transfer speeds of roughly 155 megabytes a second and took roughly 35 seconds to copy a 5.2 gigabyte file. A Realtek ALC1220 audio codec, which supports Creative Sound Blaster Cinema 5, can be found, and you'll find this on just about every ASRock board these days. Rear I/O does look rather lacking, with only 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 and 3 USB 3.2 Gen 2, 2 being Type A and the last being Type C, which is the combo Thunderbolt port. ASRock have opted to go for an internal USB 3.2 Gen 1 port instead of the newer Type C internal header. I can only assume this is because of the limited options out there for ITX cases with front panel Type C. Once again, ASRock have added their new built-in I/O shield, which has slight movements in all directions for better case fitment. Now when it comes to mITX motherboards, they can be a little bit tricky depending on the case you go with. There's mini ITX cases, and then there's also the small form factor cases, which are slightly smaller again. As when it comes to ATX motherboards, they pretty much work in most standard ATX cases. So what I've done, I'm gonna do a quick little build with this motherboard, see how it all goes, come back, and then I'll sort of explain if I had any issues with the overall build process. Alrighty, now this is the final build here. I wanted to make it a bit of a challenge, so I dug up the smallest chassis I could find. This is the Cool Link mITX case. I don't know the exact same model, but I think they are sold at Case King in Germany. This is one of those sort of different two-sided ones. It is an FFF chassis, so it is relatively small. Now the first encounter I had with this were the M.2 temps. Now as you can see, you've got your motherboard and your power supply on this side, and then if I spin it around, we have the GPU on here. Now I didn't skimp out on the GPU, I went with an RTX 2080 Ti, and as I mentioned earlier, the M.2 SSD on this board sits at the back. So currently the M.2 is sitting in the middle sandwiched here. So there is basically no airflow. Heatsink height is limited. It's got a very, very thin heatsink on it. And when I was benching this SSD, it was reaching up to 80, 85 degrees, and there's really not much I can do about that. Now that is only in a case like this. If you had a traditional mITX chassis that has everything at the everything on your main side, and then the back side is for cabling, you are going to get some cooler temps. You'll have some more room where the side panel goes on, and you'll also have a CPU cutout hole behind the motherboard. This case did not have it, so it's literally just nearly pushed up against the that sort of middle panel in there. And also when doing gaming, it's not going to stress your SSD as much, because I was sort of just hammering this SSD in a few benchmarks, and that's why the temp was getting up there. Now another thing I want to touch base on is the cooler size. Not so much for the case, but for this board, even with something with the Intel stock cooler, the sort of all four sides of the cooler were pretty much nearly touching something on this board. So I can't stress enough to check out that compatibility list on the ASRock website. I managed to find that the G.SKill CPU block does fit on this board. I will be doing a water cooled build coming up, so I'll throw up an image of that, but even that was very, very tight. But that is a big block, and it's not just the block size itself, it's actually the bolt down mechanisms that hold your CPU blocks down. If they are a little bit big and bulky, they may hit something around the sides. And then lastly I wanted to cover were the one thing I haven't covered are the fan headers. Now a lot of ITX boards can be limited these days. I think there's another board out there that has two, and one of those is being used by the chipset fan. So this board has three, and it has a dedicated separate fan header for the chipset fan. So you're getting three dedicated PWM headers on this board, which I think is pretty much spot on for an ITX chassis. Like I've got one being used in here for there is a top fan up here. I'm not sure if it really does anything because the PCI riser cable is pushed up against it. And then I've got, of course, the CPU cooler is plugged into the one of the others, and then there's still one spare. So yeah, I think three is the right amount. And then lastly, the price on this board is recommended retail is $239 US. I can't find this in Australia yet. That was purely on the Newegg website in the US. So I don't think that's too bad, pretty much in line with most of the other mITX X570 boards. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Just something a little bit different doing this little build. I want to thank ASRock for sending this out to check out, and stay tuned for more videos.